Democrats should move on from identity politics. It's not working for them or for us. Democrats are hemorrhaging the very voters they think they're pandering to. The Financial Times writes, Democrats are going backwards faster with voters of color than any other demographic, and suggests the reason is that a less racially divided America is an America where people vote more based on their beliefs than their identity. Exactly. Far-left liberals are living in an old paradigm. Americans don't fit into neat little boxes anymore. You're still building your politics around slicing and dicing people into these fixed categories. Democrats need to get the memo that you can't win elections anymore by automatically assuming you're going to get every voter who's not these guys.
They gathered in secret, behind closed doors at the opulent Ritz-Carlton, Half Moon Bay. The menu? Mini lobster rolls and seared sea bass. But this wasn't a culinary conference, it was a desperate DNC powwow. Exposed as a shocking admission, Democrats are hemorrhaging male voters. Their bizarre solution, a movement ironically dubbed SAM, Speaking with American Men, was designed to win back a demographic they had dangerously alienated. This wasn't about strategy, it was a frantic attempt to understand a voter bloc they no longer recognized, highlighting a profound disconnect that threatened their very future. The alarm bells were ringing, but few seemed to hear the true implications.
The only scene that you're obsessed with in Titanic, hint, it has tits. Bruce Lee versus Bigfoot, mythical fight scenarios to man up your Joe Rogan appearance. Intersectionality and the importance of shutting the fuck up about it. And undouching your face, man beards from Ted Cruz to J.D. Vance.
Bill Maher, usually a staunch liberal voice, dropped the bombshell, accusing the DNC of drifting perilously out of touch with everyday Americans. His warning wasn't just about midterm elections, he sensed something far deeper, a fundamental rift between the party and the people it claimed to represent. Democrats, Maher argued, were trapped in an old paradigm, relying on outdated political tactics. The Financial Times even reported a stunning reversal. Democrats were losing voters of color faster than any other demographic, a critical shift that sent shockwaves through the party's presumed base. This wasn't just a misstep, it was a crisis of identity, ironically for a party obsessed with it. The SAM initiative epitomized this disconnect, born from the stark reality of lost male support. Men, it seemed, felt increasingly portrayed by the Democratic Party as incompetent, disposable, or incapable of standing on their own. This perception, more damaging than any specific policy, had ignited a deep resentment, frustration, and an alarming sense of alienation. Rather than engage in dialogue, these feelings festered, eventually erupting at the ballot box. The DNC's elaborate high-end symposium was a belated and seemingly misguided attempt to understand the problem, a desperate effort to reconnect with a demographic that felt utterly abandoned and disrespected. The symposium's internal seminars revealed talking points so absurd they bordered on parody. Imagine political strategists debating how to keep your liberal base while putting guns on your Christmas card, or discussing best protein powder for a clean bulk and other dude conversation starters. The list spiraled into outright farce, Bud Light etiquette, when to drink it, when to shoot it, and perhaps the most telling, fishing, the bizarre hobby working-class men enjoy instead of pickleball. These were not genuine insights, they were caricatures, revealing a profound and dangerous ignorance of the very people they sought to persuade, betraying a complete lack of understanding about men's real lives. Maher's unmistakable smirk, captured on live television, spoke volumes. It wasn't just amusement, it was utter disbelief at the DNC's profound detachment. These weren't the concerns that kept men awake at night. Men weren't obsessing over gun aesthetics or muscle-building shakes. Their anxieties were far more grounded and immediate. They worried about job security, soaring prices, mortgage payments, and the safety of their families and their communities. The party's ill-conceived talking points were not just ineffective, they were an insult, reducing complex individuals to simplistic, often demeaning stereotypes, further widening the chasm of misunderstanding between voters and politicians. What truly resonated as resentment among men was the feeling of being reduced to a stereotype, portrayed as clueless, toxic, or perpetually in need of correction. This caricature simply didn't align with how most men saw themselves: hardworking, responsible, and striving to do right by their families. They weren't seeking applause or empty gestures. They were asking for something far more fundamental: not to be mocked. They yearned for acknowledgement of their struggles, their immense responsibilities, and yes, their masculinity, without being told it was something to apologize for or shrink away from in modern public discourse. This disrespect was profoundly damaging. The conversation also drifted to other bizarre seminar topics, further illustrating the DNC's misreading of the room. Discussions like the only scene you're obsessed with in Titanic, hint it has tits, or Bruce Lee versus Bigfoot, mythical fight scenarios to man up your Joe Logan appearance, showcased a desperate, misguided attempt to connect through crude, hyper-masculine tropes. This wasn't about understanding men's values, it was about peddling stereotypes. Maher recognized that men weren't chasing macho posturing, they were chasing stability, purpose, and the fundamental human need to feel valued in a society where many believed their contributions were increasingly dismissed or minimized. A dire miscalculation. Maher's warning was clear: if the DNC genuinely hoped to rebuild trust, it couldn't rely on shallow assumptions or symbolic gestures. It had to recalibrate its message, address real concerns, and speak in a way that felt authentic and genuine to everyday Americans. Otherwise, that smirk of disbelief could swiftly evolve into something far more serious, a potent warning sign. Ignored at their peril, the political landscape was shifting beneath their feet, and old playbooks were failing. Voters were not pawns to be moved by simplistic appeals. They were thinking individuals demanding respect and practical solutions, a truth the party was slow to grasp. Beyond male voters, Democrats faced a disturbing slippage among key racial groups, particularly within Black and Latino communities. While not massive enough to completely reshape the electoral map, these shifts were deeply significant, signaling that even in traditionally dependable strongholds, Trump and his allies were making measurable inroads. This alarming trend raised red flags across the entire political spectrum, highlighting a broader dissatisfaction. Voters were not solely responding to identity-based appeals. They were reacting to economic pressures, safety concerns, and the promise of opportunities for advancement, often finding the DNC's messaging repetitive or disconnected from their daily realities. Maher directly condemned outdated racial pandering as a primary reason Democrats continued to lose elections. He pointed to the infamous image of Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi donning kente cloth, scoffing that it likely didn't earn them one vote for their powerful emotional ties to Ghana. This symbolic gesture, devoid of tangible impact, illustrated a broader problem: a reliance on optics over outcomes. Voters, Maher argued, were becoming increasingly skeptical of messaging that felt purely tailored around identity, without delivering meaningful, tangible results, seeing through the performance and demanding genuine substance instead of theatrical displays. California, a state often at the forefront of progressive policies, offered a startling example of identity politics taken to an extreme. Beyond the familiar Amber Alerts for missing children, the state had introduced Ebony Alerts for Black children and Feather Alerts for Native American kids. "What is that?" Maher questioned, articulating a widespread bewilderment. This segregation of kidnapping alerts, however well-intentioned, became a potent symbol of an approach that, to many, felt counterproductive and divisive, reinforcing racial divisions rather than fostering unity, inadvertently exacerbating the very issues it aimed to address and further alienating a public yearning for cohesion. The underlying issue, Maher contended, was that politics at its core must be about trust and results, not just identity. Even small shifts in voting patterns could signal deeper dissatisfaction brewing beneath the surface, a quiet discontent that, if ignored, could quietly grow into a much larger political problem over time. When messaging felt overly scripted or symbolic, rather than practical and impactful, it risked losing its influence entirely. Voters were no longer swayed by inherited loyalties or predictable demographic patterns. They demanded politicians earn their trust continuously through clear policies, honest communication, and results that resonated across diverse and changing communities. The very concept of identity politics, Maher argued, was increasingly antiquated in modern America. From 2010 to 2020, the number of people identifying as multiracial skyrocketed by an astonishing 276%. Today, 1 in 5 newlyweds are in an interracial marriage, a statistic that would make the classic film Guess Who's Coming to Dinner almost obsolete. Americans overwhelmingly approved of interracial marriage, especially with Rich in Love. The demographics had fundamentally shifted, yet political strategies remained stubbornly fixed on outdated categories, failing to grasp the profound evolution of a society increasingly rejecting rigid, predefined boxes in favor of complex, fluid identities. Prominent figures, some of them people of color themselves, voiced strong opposition to the relentless focus on race. Idris Elba famously stated that this obsession could hinder people's aspirations. Actress Raven Simonet echoed the sentiment to Oprah, declaring, "I'm tired of being labeled. I'm not an African American. I'm an American. My roots are in Louisiana." Morgan Freeman asserted that the way to end racism was simply to stop talking about it. There was even a burgeoning movement, led by people of color like Professor Sheena Mason, advocating for banning racial questions on the census, believing that to undo racism, we have to undo our belief in race. For years, identity politics served as a powerful electoral tool for the left, effectively mobilizing voters and forging dependable coalitions. It created clear narratives, strong emotional connections, and a vital sense of political belonging. But that strategy, Maher contended, was now losing its edge. Many voters were beginning to question whether identity-focused messaging truly translated into meaningful improvements in their daily lives. They no longer wanted symbolic recognition alone. They increasingly demanded practical results, better economic opportunities, safer neighborhoods, and a future they could genuinely feel secure in, marking a significant shift in political expectations and priorities. Voters, it seemed, were paying closer attention to tangible outcomes, not just persuasive language. They were actively asking whether political promises led to real, observable change or merely served as convenient campaign talking points. This growing skepticism reflected a broader shift in public expectations. Loyalty was no longer automatic or guaranteed. Politicians were now compelled to prove their value through concrete action, not assumptions about demographic allegiances. As this heightened awareness spread, traditional campaign strategies, rooted solely in identity, would struggle to wield the same influence they once did in shaping election outcomes and voter trust. The call to move on from identity politics mirrored the founding principle of MoveOn.org, a liberal group formed in 1998 to urge Republicans to move past the Clinton impeachment. Now the roles were reversed, with the same message directed at Democrats. The strategy simply wasn't working, hemorrhaging the very voters the party thought it was pandering to. The Financial Times data unequivocally showed Democrats losing ground faster with voters of color than any other demographic, suggesting a critical reason. A less racially divided America was an America where people voted more based on their beliefs and values, rather than rigid, imposed identities. A profound electoral awakening. This realization underscored a critical truth. Americans no longer fit into neat, predetermined boxes. The old paradigm of slicing and dicing people into fixed categories was obsolete. Identity politics, Maher warned, was now costing the DNC more votes than it gained, as a growing number of Americans actively pushed back against being defined by a single label. Voters yearned to be seen as complex individuals, shaped by their unique values, experiences, and beliefs, refusing to be reduced to simplistic categories based solely on race or background, asserting their independence from archaic political molds. This pushback represented a fundamental shift in the electorate's self-perception. There was a mounting resistance to the presumption that people must vote a certain way simply because others who shared their demographic characteristics traditionally had. For many, that expectation felt inherently limiting, even dismissive of their independence and personal judgment. Voters increasingly demanded the freedom to evaluate policies on their merits, not on narratives constructed solely around identity. They wanted to be genuinely persuaded, not simply presumed to be loyal. This profound shift reflected a deeper, more pervasive desire for authenticity in politics, a demand to be respected as thinkers, decision-makers, and citizens first and foremost, before any other label. Maher cited compelling examples of America's evolving fluid landscape. 2/3 of Republican voters now supported weed legalization, while a surprising 41% of Democrats owned or lived with someone who owned a gun. The cultural tapestry was equally diverse. Miss Marvel was Pakistani, and the winner of the last 2 NBA dunk contests was white. These illustrations vividly demonstrated that the country was no longer defined by rigid boundaries or predetermined paths tied to race or background. Opportunity had become more fluid, allowing individuals from all walks of life to pursue roles and identities that once seemed entirely out of reach, defying old assumptions. This transformation, Maher asserted, reflected something deeply positive. progress, not loss. It showcased a society moving closer to its founding ideals, where people were judged by their ability, character, and ambition rather than by assumptions about their origins. This expanding sense of possibility, where limits were challenged and barriers fell, was precisely what America was meant to embody. Individuals were defining their own futures, not inheriting someone else's expectations or constraints imposed by history alone, signaling a vibrant, self-determined spirit that transcended outdated political categorizations. The nation was growing, but its politics lagged far behind. The stark reality, Maher concluded, was that the more politicians obsessed over identity, the more they willfully ignored the bread-and-butter issues that ultimately won and lost elections. The true dividing line in America was increasingly about class, not race, and the most significant chasm was the diploma divide, a chasm of opportunity and aspiration. The real future of the Democratic Party, and perhaps even the future of democracy itself, hinged on Democrats recognizing this profound shift, pivoting away from divisive identity politics, and instead addressing the fundamental economic and social concerns that truly resonated with a diverse, evolving electorate. Ultimately, Bill Maher's message transcended mere party loyalty. It was a harsh dose of political reality. He warned that the ground beneath the Democrats was irrevocably shifting, and outdated strategies simply would not hold the same power. Voters were changing, thinking differently, questioning assumptions that once went unchallenged. They demanded to be heard, respected, and understood as individuals, not merely managed as predictable voting blocks. The frustration Maher highlighted wasn't just political, it was a profound cultural shift, reflecting a growing demand for authenticity, honesty, and leadership that authentically spoke to real-world concerns. Economic stability, personal dignity, and national unity were taking precedence over symbolic messaging. If political leaders failed to recognize this seismic shift, voters would continue to respond in the only way they could, at the ballot box, relegating those who refused to adapt to irrelevance in a rapidly changing political landscape.